there, Impact Club. This is Amy Winans. This week I'm going to be sharing with you guys a little bit about Thanksgiving. I know Thanksgiving is coming up for you guys next week and you get the week off of school. And so I just want to make sure that you can take some time to be really intentional with the time of being able to focus on Thanksgiving. So I want to start off by asking you guys a question. What do you think about when you hear the word Thanksgiving? Do you think about watching football games? Do you think about eating a lot of food, hanging out with your families, playing games? Like, what is it that comes to mind when you think about Thanksgiving? And do you think about it just as a one-day thing? Or do you think about it as more than one day? Does it actually impact your life? So I want to set sort of a backstage story for you guys. First of all, I want you to know that this idea of Thanksgiving is something that God instituted from the very beginning. It's not something that happened just when the Pilgrims came over, and it isn't even just related to the Pilgrims, although we'll talk about that in our time together today. But it started way back in Genesis when God had Noah get in that big boat and he took all those animals and he saved his family during that time of the flood. When Noah got off that boat, one of the first things he did was he had a time of thanksgiving to God. And it continued on. If you guys know about Moses, he was a pretty big figure back in the Old Testament with God's people. And that was another thing that God set up with Moses. In fact, they were supposed to, with God's chosen people, the Israelites, have a week-long time of harvest and Thanksgiving. So after they brought in the harvest, God said, I want you to celebrate for a whole week. It wasn't even just a day. It was like a week-long celebration to have a time of Thanksgiving. And then that just continued on with the kings, with King David and King Solomon. They continued that tradition, declaring these special times of celebration and thanksgiving to God. In fact, the Bible has over 140 passages that talk about Thanksgiving. And some of those really familiar ones are found in the book of Psalms. We can find a lot of them in that book, like things like Psalms 109:30, with my mouth I will give thanks abundantly to the Lord, or give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known among the nations what he has done, Psalm 105:1. If you get to the New Testament, we even see Jesus constantly giving thanks to the Father in his relationship with him. And he too celebrated that time with the Thanksgiving festival that Moses had set back in the Old Testament times. That was still being celebrated even with Jesus. And Paul also, if you read any of the letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament to the Corinthians and the Thessalonians and the Galatians and the Philippians, he always starts by talking about being thankful and giving thanks for them. So there's just this attitude that we can get right out of God's word that talks about how we as God's people are to be a thankful people. And it's not just a one-day thing on Thanksgiving. It's a thanks living. It's a way of life. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of having a mindset that is thankful. But I want to talk to you guys about kind of where we get Thanksgiving from here living in the United States of America. It's an important story to me because I actually have been able to track my descendants of my family on my mom's side all the way back to the Mayflower. I had a man named Edward Doty come over on the Mayflower. And it's kind of a big deal because I know that that's a part of who I am and it's a part of my story. And although he came over as a slave, actually, to serve on the boat, I know that he was able to survive that first really tough winter, or I wouldn't be here today because that's part of my lineage. So part of Peyton's too. And so it's a part of our story. So we wanted to share a little bit of this story with you, because I want you guys to understand that even through difficult circumstances like this group of people went through, they were able to find things to be thankful because they had that mindset of Thanksgiving. So here's kind of the backstory as to why these pilgrims did that. In the early 1600s, King James I of England decreed that everyone should be part of a state church and be made to conform to all of its practices and doctrines. It wasn't a choice, and you had to be a part of this. Anyone who refused became known as a separatist because they were separate from the state church. And if you were a separatist, you risked fines, imprisonment, and persecution. In 1606, 300 clergymen separated themselves from this state church, believing that the reform within the church was hopeless. They came together and were known as the Lord's Free People. They formed a church, these 300 pastors, basically. Then, 1 year later, in 1607, the king sent troops to arrest one of these pastors named William Brewster for his leadership in this separatist movement. The separatist response was then to run away, so they actually fled to another country called Holland. And sadly, the persecution followed them there to Holland. So they continued on to the Netherlands, where they were finally accepted. There was only one small rule that they had to follow, which wasn't so small, if they were going to live in the Netherlands. And that was that they could not preach the good news of who Jesus was. They could not tell other people about the Bible. They could not tell other people about God. So they could worship privately on their own with people who believed, but they were not able to tell anybody else about what they believed. That's kind of a big deal and kind of important. So finally, after 12 years of this going on, they decided enough was enough. And it was time for the youngest and the strongest to go first over to this new world. So the roster was open for volunteers to go. William Brewster was appointed to take the pastoral responsibilities for the group. He was that same guy who had been arrested earlier. No one, though, could have imagined all the difficulties that they were going to face. It was amazing that on that little boat ride, only one death occurred because it was pretty brutal on the ocean. After 66 days of riding in that Mayflower boat, that vulnerable little group arrived at Plymouth Rock. Unfortunately, it took them longer than they thought, so they got there December 2nd of 1620. What awaited them was an ice-bound coastline with a dense unknown forest. Leaving the cold gray Atlantic Ocean behind them, they went ashore. In keeping with their faith and their solemn purpose, they knelt in that snow, they prayed, and they worshiped God and gave thanks that they had made it. During that first harsh winter, the Pilgrims faced unbelievable hardships. Sickness engulfed them, followed by great suffering and death. Governor Carver was one of the victims. Young William Bradford, only 31 at the time, was quickly chosen to become the next governor. Bradford had journaled all about the voyage on the Mayflower and kept a little notebook recording the deaths of his friends. One by one, people started to die. The list soon even included his own wife, Dorothy. With grim regularity, they would dig these shallow graves. Digging in the frozen ground took place at night. Loved ones were laid to rest in secrecy and in unmarked graves for fear that the native people might discover that the pilgrim numbers were dwindling. At one point, when the plague was most severe, only 7 of the group were able to move around to care for the others. Only half of the original group that landed there were able to make it through that winter. The rest died. An early spring, followed by a long summer and lots of hard work, though, eventually produced a bountiful harvest, assuring the survival of this colony. Warmer and sturdier cabins were built in preparation for what they now knew was going to be another harsh winter. Having experienced Harvest Home Festival in their native England and having participated with the Dutch in Leyden in the annual Thank Day in memory of the deliverance from the invading Spaniards in 1574, it was natural for Bradford to think to combine the two festivals together, and so the people responded enthusiastically with this huge time of Thanksgiving. The fields were ripe with Indian corn. The rivers and sea overflowed with lobster and clam and oysters and cod and bass. Did you know they had seafood at that Thanksgiving celebration? The dense forest proved to be filled with wild fowl and game, including great quantities of turkeys. You got it. Their little gardens bloomed with a variety of salad greens, and over the summer they had gathered fruit and cranberries and gooseberries and strawberries and plums and cherries. The native people taught them how to dry the produce for the future. Collectively, they were very grateful and an optimistic bunch. This little group, rather than dwelling on all that was wrong in their situation, and in appreciation for all the help they had received from the native people, invited them to participate as they thanked God. 2 activities were planned for that 3-day celebration. Worship services featuring prayer, praise, and thanksgiving to God, and a magnificent time of feasting. Enjoying the bountiful harvest, followed by games and sport. Well, you know the story. Chief Massasoit accepted the invitation and arrived with 90 hungry braves. It must have been quite a shock when so many showed up to that first invitation. Chief Massasoit must have sensed the tension because he went out and sent his braves out, and within no time at all, came back with 5 fat deer that they were able to cook right up. But did you know that all of the food that was prepared for the 90 braves and the 52 pilgrims was made by only 4 or 5 pilgrim women and maybe 3 teenage girls? That was a lot of work for them, but I don't think they minded. They were so grateful. They were so thankful for the friendships they had made there, for God carrying them through that really harsh time, for their lives, and then for all the ways that God had provided for them through that food. So I hope that this Thanksgiving next week, you will take some time to think about what are some great things that God has done for you. So often our response is kind of a reflex reaction to Thanksgiving time. Like, oh yeah, I gotta be thankful for the day. Instead of it being like a thoughtful, planned time where we really pause and really thank God and thank others for what they have done. Here's what I want to conclude with you guys today. I want to challenge you to think about this verse that's found in 1 Thessalonians 5:18. It says, "In everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." In everything, give thanks. And I want you to think of it as more than just a one day, oh yeah, I'm going to give thanks to God for everything today. But instead, in everything, live thanks. How can you live thanks? How can your life look thankful every single day? The best way for us to thank God for the gift of life is to live it for Him with joy. And joy is not a feeling. It's a choice that we can make, that we can choose no matter a good day or a bad day, happy situations or tough situations. The best way to thank God for your spiritual gifts and your talents and your abilities and your personality He's given you is to accept them and then invest them in others. Actually doing things for others with the way that God has gifted and made you. It gives you purpose and value, and it actually helps you find out a little bit more about who you are. And the best way to thank God for all the family and friends that He's given you and all the things that He's done for you is by doing things for other people. So what can you do for others? How can you take your life as an investment for others? These are ways that we can have a life of thanks living. Happy Thanksgiving, you guys.